There is a people who were legally classified as fugitive property across an entire continent, hunted by slave catchers, chased across state lines, pursued into two different countries, and who responded by building their own independent military alliance, fighting two wars to a standstill, and eventually earning some of the highest military honors either the United States or Mexico had to give. The Black Seminoles were never simply escaped slaves hiding in a swamp. They were a self-governing people who moved across 4 distinct territories in under a century, and the country that once hunted them as property eventually pinned medals on their chests. The story begins in Spanish Florida in the 1700s, where enslaved Africans escaping British colonies to the north found refuge among the Seminole, an indigenous people themselves formed relatively recently from Creek and other indigenous groups who had moved into Florida. The relationship that developed wasn't simple absorption. Black Seminoles maintained their own towns, their own leaders, their own language distinct from the wider Seminole nation, functioning as allies, and, in many cases, as respected advisors and warriors rather than as property within Seminole society itself, a relationship strikingly different from slavery as practiced elsewhere in the American South. When the United States fought the Seminole Wars across the early 1800s, Black Seminole warriors fought alongside their Seminole allies with a reputation for skill and ferocity that American military commanders documented directly, one of the primary reasons the wars dragged on as long and cost as much as they did. Then came Indian removal. In the 1830s, the United States forced the Seminole Nation, Black Seminoles included, onto the Trail of Tears to Indian Territory, in what is now Oklahoma. For the Black Seminoles specifically, removal carried a danger the rest of the Seminole Nation didn't face in the same way: proximity to slaveholding states and slave catchers, who considered them recapturable property regardless of their free status among the Seminole. Fearing re-enslavement, a significant portion of the Black Seminole population made a decision few populations in American history have had to make. They left the United States entirely. In 1850, under the leadership of Black Seminole Chief John Horse and Seminole leader Wildcat, a group of Black Seminoles crossed into Mexico, which had abolished slavery decades earlier, and offered them land in exchange for military service defending the northern frontier against raids. They founded the settlement of Nacimiento de los Negros in Coahuila, a community that still exists today, its residents still identifying as descendants of that original founding group. Mexico became the second nation this population called home, and it granted them something the United States never had: unambiguous legal freedom. Given a history this specific, this well-documented, and this dramatic, spanning Spanish Florida, forced removal to Oklahoma, and a deliberate flight to Mexican sovereignty specifically to escape re-enslavement, you'd expect this population's later return to United States territory to be equally well understood, a straightforward continuation of an already thoroughly documented story. Before we get to what happened next, it's worth sitting with how unusual the return itself was. Most populations that fled slavery by leaving the country stayed gone. The Black Seminoles didn't. In 1870, a group returned across the border into Texas, this time not as fugitives but as recruits, enlisting in the United States Army as the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts, a specialized unit tasked with tracking and frontier operations along the Texas-Mexico border. Over the following decades, these scouts distinguished themselves so thoroughly in combat that 4 of them were awarded the Medal of Honor, the United States military's highest decoration, an extraordinary outcome for descendants of a population the country had, within living memory of some of these very soldiers' parents, legally hunted as escaped property. Here's where the story gets more complicated than a simple triumphant arc, and it's worth being honest about that complication rather than smoothing over it. A 1,997 genetic study of the officially recognized Seminole tribe of Florida found something that surprised researchers: 95% Native American maternal lineages with only a small trace, about 5%, of African maternal ancestry, and no African Y chromosome lineages detected at all among the male line samples tested. That finding describes the officially enrolled Seminole tribe specifically, not the Black Seminole freedmen communities in Oklahoma, Texas, and Mexico, whose identity and history this episode is actually about. A distinction that matters enormously and gets flattened constantly in casual conversation about this population. That distinction sits at the center of a real, ongoing, and unresolved political dispute that this channel isn't going to pretend has a clean resolution. The 1866 treaty between the United States and the Seminole Nation, signed after the Civil War, contains explicit language guaranteeing Black Seminole freedmen and their descendants full citizenship rights within the Seminole Nation, regardless of blood quantum, a treaty-guaranteed status that predates and exists entirely independent of any genetic testing standard. In the decades since, various tribal governments, the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma among them, have at different points restricted or contested freedmen citizenship rights based on blood quantum requirements that many freedmen and legal advocates argue directly violate the 1866 treaty's explicit language. Genetic ancestry testing has, in this specific context, become a genuinely contested tool, one some freedmen descendants actively resist submitting to, precisely because they worry it could be used to strip away treaty rights that were never supposed to depend on a blood or DNA threshold in the first place. If a population successfully defending a 19th century treaty right against modern attempts to redefine their identity through genetic testing is the kind of ongoing fight that deserves more attention, say so in the comments. And if you have direct knowledge of how this dispute has played out in specific freedmen communities, we want to hear it, because this is exactly the kind of contested, living history where the people involved know more than any outside researcher does. It's worth adding a comparative note here, because the Black Seminole freedmen situation isn't unique among the 5 tribes forced onto the Trail of Tears. The Cherokee Nation faced a strikingly similar dispute with its own freedmen population, descendants of people the Cherokee Nation itself had enslaved before emancipation, whose treaty-guaranteed citizenship rights were contested and, at various points, formally revoked through tribal constitutional amendments requiring proof of Cherokee blood, only to be restored decades later, following federal court intervention. The Cherokee freedmen case has drawn more national attention and legal scrutiny than the Seminole freedmen situation, but the underlying pattern and 1866 treaty guaranteeing citizenship regardless of blood quantum, followed generations later by tribal governments attempting to impose exactly the blood-based standard the treaty explicitly rejected, repeats closely enough across multiple nations that it points to something larger than any single tribe's internal politics. It reflects an unresolved tension embedded directly into the post-Civil War treaties themselves, one that continues playing out in tribal courts and legislatures more than a century and a half after the language was first signed. It's worth dwelling on what made Black Seminole society within Florida genuinely distinct from slavery as it operated elsewhere in the American South, because the difference wasn't subtle. Black Seminole towns operated with a significant degree of self-governance, controlling their own agricultural production, maintaining their own armed warriors, and answering to their own town leaders, rather than to Seminole overseers in any direct sense. Historians studying the relationship have described it closer to a tributary or allied relationship than to chattel slavery, with Black Seminoles sometimes providing agricultural goods or military support to Seminole leaders in exchange for protection and land, an arrangement that gave them far more autonomy than enslaved people anywhere else in the region at the time. This distinction became militarily significant during the Seminole Wars specifically, because Black Seminole fighters had every reason to fight with the same intensity as their Seminole allies. A Spanish or American victory didn't just threaten Seminole sovereignty. For Black Seminoles specifically, it threatened a return to actual chattel slavery, a stake in the outcome that made their participation in the fighting some of the fiercest documented on either side. The scouts who returned to Texas in 1870 carried that same intensity into their new role and the specific conditions of their service are worth naming directly. The Seminole Negro Indian Scouts operated with extraordinarily small numbers, rarely more than a few dozen men at any given time, tasked with tracking hostile raiding parties across some of the most difficult terrain the U.S. Army operated in during the period. Their effectiveness became so well documented that military commanders specifically requested their continued service, even as the broader scout program elsewhere in the Frontier Army was being scaled back, a reputation earned entirely through repeated performance in combat rather than through any official favor. The 4 Medal of Honor recipients, John Ward, Pompey Factor, Isaac Payne, and Adam Payne, earned their decorations for actions during specific documented engagements against raiding parties along the Texas frontier in the 1870s, a level of formal military recognition that very few units of any composition achieved during that era of American frontier warfare. For Black Seminole communities today, spread primarily across Brackettville, Texas, Nacimiento in Coahuila, Mexico, and communities in Oklahoma tracing directly back to the original Indian Territory settlement, this layered history of alliance, exile, military service, and ongoing legal struggle remains an active, lived identity rather than a closed historical chapter. The Seminole Indian Scout Cemetery in Brackettville still hosts annual ceremonies honoring the 4 Medal of Honor recipients and the broader Scout tradition, drawing descendants from all 3 countries their ancestors once called home. Nacimiento's residents maintain distinct cultural traditions, language fragments, and oral histories connecting them directly back to the 1850 founding migration, a community that has now existed continuously in Mexico for over a century and a half. What the Black Seminoles add to this series is a story this channel can state with full confidence in some respects and has to leave honestly open in others. The 4-nation journey, Florida to Oklahoma to Mexico to Texas, is not in dispute. The military service and the Medal of Honor recognitions are not in dispute. What remains genuinely unresolved is a citizenship question that a 19th century treaty already answered clearly, and that modern institutions have spent decades trying to answer differently. A people hunted as property-built alliances, crossed 4 national borders, and earned their country's highest military honor. Whether that same country's institutions have fully honored the promise made to them in 1866 is a question the freedmen themselves are still fighting to have answered correctly. That fight, unlike the historical record of the 4-nation journey itself, doesn't have a tidy ending yet, and this channel would rather leave it exactly that honest than manufacture a resolution the people actually living it haven't reached.